DW News live from Berlin. Germany stands up for its decision to arm Ukraine. You're seeing live pictures from the Bundestag where German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is about to explain his reversal of a decades-old policy that prevented arms shipments to conflict zones. We will have full coverage for you. I'm Anya Coopers-McKinnon. Thanks so much for joining us today. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has some explaining to do here in Germany after a landmark decision to send weapons to Ukraine as it resists Russia's invasion. The Bundestag has convened to hear from the Chancellor on why he's backtracked on German policy that long banned weapons exports to war zones. Scholz's decision to send anti-tank weapons and missiles came after intense pressure from partners and brings Berlin into line with other Western allies supplying arms to Ukraine. And while we're waiting to join the speech about to be given by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, I am joined by DW's chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, to talk more about what we're about to hear. A momentous decision. It's a major U-turn for the German government, this decision. What was it that finally pushed it to change course on arms deliveries to Ukraine?
Well, as Chancellor Olaf Scholz himself said yesterday evening in a tweet, we are at a historic turning point, and that turning point for Germany is really momentous. In some ways, this looks like the end of the post-World War II era over 70 years, or nearly 70 years later. And the fact is that we are seeing Germany essentially now throw overboard a long-standing prohibition on the shipment of weapons to conflict zones. That prohibition reflected a lesson learned from World War II, a war of aggression that Germany itself started. And it included a taboo, particularly on sending weapons to any zone where they might be used against Russian soldiers, given the fact that Germany had inflicted terrible suffering on Russia. But under the circumstances that we're seeing now, with, of course, an enormous amount of criticism from NATO partners, the indirect criticism from the U.S., it has been somewhat more restrained than some of Germany's NATO allies. But nonetheless, a lot of questioning of this prohibition, particularly since Germany is a major weapons exporter, and its weapons do, in fact, often find their ways to conflict zones. So we are now seeing this turnaround with Chancellor Olaf Scholz clearly having done some soul-searching, also having met with his leading ministers from all three of the coalition parties. So we are seeing real unity on this amongst the parties represented in the coalition and amongst the largest of the opposition parties, the Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union, which, of course, those are Angela Merkel's, that's Angela Merkel's party, which had also long adhered to this prohibition.
OK, so it's not a controversial decision within German politics. What about the German people? You know, how will they feel about this decision? It's not something everyone's going to be comfortable with, is it?
No, and we're seeing tremendous rethinking also among the public. I can't tell you how many messages I've received from well-informed German friends who said, we didn't think Putin would do this. We truly believed in the German idea that through commercial relations we ensure stability and moderation. So yes, there's a lot of soul-searching, there's a lot of questioning, but we're also seeing many people saying, yes, it's time, particularly in the face of these pictures of valiant Ukrainian forces standing up to a vast force of the Russian military, vastly outnumbering them, and also, as everyone has said, you know, a one-sided war, Putin's war, a war of aggression.
Yeah, I mean, a sense that potentially in Germany this is the right thing to do now, but of course, historically, Germans have been terribly against, haven't they, involvement in any kind of conflict, any kind of weapon. So I'm sure that there are some people...
There is deeply ingrained pacifism in this country. Some would say to the point of naivete. And in fact, Olaf Scholz this week has often used the word naive, saying we must pursue diplomacy, but not to the point of naivete. But in fact, many would say there have been occasions when it looked a lot like naivete, or at least, let's say, very, very unrealistic. Nonetheless, it is valid always to pursue a diplomatic course. The big question is only, do you simultaneously pursue a deterrent course? And in many ways, clinging to diplomacy was part of the lesson that Germany learned, not only during World War or from World War II, but afterward during the Cold War, when the Social Democratic Party in particular pursued Ostpolitik, maintaining commercial and cultural relations with Eastern European countries behind the Iron Curtain, in the hope that that would change people's way of thinking. And certainly it did, but that was coupled with deterrence. And Germany at that time, including under a social democratic chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, and of course Olaf Scholz is also a social democrat, also pursued deterrence. It was here that the purging weapons were stationed, and that very much helped to bring the Russian regime to its knees. So diplomacy and deterrence together, not diplomacy to the exclusion of deterrence. And essentially, that's the change we're now seeing here.
Okay. Concretely, what kind of weapons does Germany intend to supply, and how will they even be gotten to the Ukrainian army?
Very good question. It is sending anti-tank missiles and Stinger surface-to-air missiles, 1,000 of the former, 500 of the latter. Apparently, they will probably go in via Poland, a NATO member country, and of course a neighbor of Ukraine. We don't know the details on the logistics. Also, there are two other sets of weapons that will be sent, some stockpiled in the Netherlands, others old howitzers, actually from the East German time, that had been sent to Estonia, and Estonia now wants to send them on to Ukraine. Estonia, of course, being a NATO member country, and it had been pushing hard to send on these weapons, but for weeks the Germans had resisted because, in fact, that prohibition that I mentioned applied to German manufactured weapons no matter where they're stockpiled. So those will also now be sent.
Melinda, I can see that the Chancellor is about to start speaking, so we'll cross over right now.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin,
President of
verehrte
the
Kolleginnen und Kollegen,
Bundestag, colleagues,
liebe Mitbürgerinnen und Mitbürger.
compatriots.
Der 24.
The
Februar
24th of February 2022 marked a change in the history of our continent. In attacking Ukraine, the Russian President Putin launched a war of aggression cold-bloodedly for one reason: to stop the freedom of Ukraine and put it under its yoke. This goes against humanity, this goes against international law, and there's nothing whatever that could justify this attack. The terrible images we've been seeing from Kiev, Odessa, and Mariupol show the unscrupulousness of Putin, the shocking injustice, the pain of Ukrainians all touch us very deeply. I know exactly what our fellow countrymen and women are asking themselves in the evenings, what concerns they have looking at what they're finding out from this war. Many remember our grandparents or great-grandparents talking about the war, and for younger people, it's impossible to imagine. How can there be a war in Europe now? Many of you have been expressing this outrage in Berlin. We have experienced a break in everything we have known until now, and that means that the world before this attack is not the same as the world before it. Essentially, it's about the question of whether might can break laws, whether we can allow Putin to turn back the clock to the time of imperial powers of the 19th century, or whether we can draw a line in the sand and contain this.
Das setzt eigene Stärke voraus.
This requires strength on our part. Yes, we want to show him clear boundaries. And yes, we want to defend our democracy, our freedom, and our prosperity. And I'm grateful to you, President of the Bundestag, for convening this special session. And I'm glad that I'm able to speak to all of you. And I want to thank all of the leaders of the parliamentary groups of all the different parties for supporting the convening of this special session of the Bundestag. Ladies and gentlemen, in attacking Ukraine, Putin doesn't just want to eradicate a country from the world map. He is destroying the European security structure that we have had since the final act of Helsinki for nearly half a century. And in doing so, he is putting himself outside of the international community. Worldwide, we have worked with France to try to get the UN Security Council to name Russia's attack as what it is, namely an infamous break of international law and order. And I believe we have some success. What we have seen is that we are not alone in defending peace, and we will continue to work towards achieving this. And I'm very grateful to German Foreign Minister Baerbock for what she has achieved thus far as well in this regard. It was only by using the emergency brake of veto, a permanent member of the Security Council, that they could prevent this. That in itself is an outrage. President Putin keeps talking about inviolable security, but what he's actually doing is using weapons to try to bring part of the continent under his power. And this will have an impact on the rest of Europe as well. Permanent security in Europe is not possible with Russia there. Putin is endangering this. And we need to not mince our words. We are tackling the challenge that these times have made of us with a cool head, resolutely. There are 5 approaches that we want to take. Firstly, we need to support Ukraine in its hour of desperate need. And in recent weeks and months, we have done this as much as we can. But with the attack on Ukraine, we find ourselves in a new age. In Kiev, in Kharkiv, Odessa, Mariupol, people are not just defending their homeland, they are fighting for liberty and democracy, for values that we share with them. As Democrats, as Europeans, we stand with you. We stand on the right side of history with you. On Thursday, President Putin, in attacking Ukraine, created a new reality. And this new reality requires a clear response. We have given this clear response. As you know, yesterday we decided that Germany will deliver weapons to Ukraine so it can defend itself. There was no other response possible to Putin's aggression. Ladies and gentlemen, our second mandate is to get Putin away from this path of warring on Ukraine. It is a disaster for Ukraine, but it will prove to be a disaster for Russia too. Together with the heads of state and government of the EU, we have approved a raft of sanctions that are unprecedented. We are cutting Russian banks, and we are taking the oligarchs money away from them, or we're focusing on where we can do that, and there will be sanctions placed on Putin and all of those close to him when it comes to visas for members of the government. And we are excluding important Russian banks from SWIFT, from the SWIFT system. We decided on this yesterday, and we are going to take this significant step. Let's not kid ourselves for a minute, though. Putin will not change his course overnight. But hopefully, very soon, the Russian leadership will feel what high price they will have to pay for this. In recent weeks, there's been a 30% plummeting on the Russian stock markets, and that shows that our sanctions are working, and we are perfectly happy to consider any other kind of sanction that we may put in place, and everything is on the table. The question remains as to what will hurt those responsible most, the ones who are to blame, and not the Russian people. Because it was Putin who chose this war, not the people of Russia, and this is why we must say very clearly that this war is Putin's war. And it's important for me to differentiate here, because the reconciliation between Germany and Russia remains an important chapter of our post-war history. And I know how hard the current situation is to bear for all of those fellow countrymen in Germany who were born in Russia or born in Ukraine. And we will not allow this conflict between Putin and the free world to tear open old wounds and cause new problems. And there's another thing we mustn't forget. In many Russian cities, plenty of citizens demonstrated against Putin's wars, risking arrest and risking physical harm to themselves. That took a great deal of courage, and we respect this. Germany stands today with Ukraine. Our thoughts and our sympathies lie with the victims of the Russian war of aggression. And we also support everyone in Russia who are countering the powerful regime of Putin and rejecting its war. And we know you are many in Russia. And I say to all of you, do not give up. I am certain that liberty, tolerance, and human rights will prevail in Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, the third major challenge we have is preventing Putin's war infecting other countries in Europe. And that means, without any ifs, ands, and buts, we are completely committed to the Mutual Defence Clause and our collective security guarantee in NATO.
Das habe ich auch unseren Alliierten in
And
Mittel- und
I
Osteuropa
assured
gesagt, die sich um ihre
this
Sicherheit
to those in Eastern Europe who worry about their own security.
nicht unterschätzen.
President Putin must not underestimate our resoluteness. We will defend the NATO territory on the basis of our collective security guarantee, inch for inch.
Wir meinen das sehr ernst.
And we mean this absolutely certainty. In taking a country into Ukraine, the will that we have as an alliance is to defend this country as we would defend ourselves. The German Armed Forces has already expanded its support for the Eastern European NATO partners, and for this important signal, I want to thank the German Ministry of Defense. In Lithuania, where we are leading the response task, we have increased our troops, and in Romania, we have expanded our air policing troop as well. We want to set up a new task force in Slovakia. Our Navy is helping with additional ships when it comes to ensuring and policing the North Sea and the Mediterranean. And we are prepared to be involved with air forces in defending the airspace near the Russian border and above the Eastern European countries. Our soldiers are men and women who have not had much time to prepare for these operations. Let me say, on behalf of all of you here, I'm sure, thank you. Thank you for your important service in these dark days. Ladies and gentlemen, based on the change that Putin's attack means for us, let me say it heralds a new age, and what needs to be done to keep the peace will be done, and Germany will do its bit. Let me say that clearly. But it's not enough just to say it, because for that, the German armed forces need new, strong capabilities. And this is my fourth issue that I wish to speak about now. This is the fourth thing I wish to speak to you about today. If you read the decrees that distort history that Putin has written, if you look at his statement that he made in TV describing his attack, and that, although I had just spoken to Putin for hours, anyone who has read what Putin says can have no doubt that Putin wants to create a Russian empire. He wants to recreate the order within Europe, and he has no fear of using military might to achieve it. And we're seeing this in Ukraine today. So we have to ask ourselves, what capabilities does Putin's Russia have, and what capabilities do we need in order to counter this threat today and in the future? One thing is for sure. We need to invest considerably more in the security of our country in order to defend our liberty and our democracy in this way as well. This is a major challenge for the entire country. It means to have a modern, progressive German armed forces, Bundeswehr, that can protect us. In the Munich Security Conference a week ago, I said we need aircraft, we need ships, and we need soldiers who are well equipped, ideally equipped for their missions. That's what it's about. And this can be done for a country as big as we are, as important as we are in Europe.
Aber machen wir uns nichts vor, bessere
But
Ausrüstung,
let's not kid
modernes
ourselves.
Einsatzgerät, mehr
Better
Personal,
equipment,
das kostet viel Geld.
more personnel, all of this costs a lot of money. And for that, we will set up a special fund for the German armed forces, and I'm grateful to German Finance Minister Lindner for his support in this.
Der Bundeshaushalt
The
2022
2022 German budget will have 100 billion euros earmarked for this as a one-off, and this money will be used for investment in the German armed forces. From now on, year for year, more than 2% of our GDP will be invested in defense.
Und meine Damen und Herren,
And, ladies and gentlemen, and I am addressing all parliamentary groups of the German Bundestag, let us approve this in our basic law.
eines will ich hinzufügen.
Something I would like to add at this point is we are not just aspiring to this goal because we have committed to this in our allies to increase our defense spending up to 2% of our GDP. We are doing it for ourselves. We are doing it for our own security.
Wohl wissend, dass sich nicht alle Bedrohungen der Zukunft mit den Mitteln
Well
der
aware of the
Bundeswehr
fact that
einlegen lassen.
it will not be enough just to have the German armed forces to stop the challenges facing us. This is why we also need to invest in development.
Deshalb werden wir unsere Resilienz stärken.
And this is why we also need to strengthen our resilience technically and socially in order to be more resilient against cyber attacks on our communication systems. And we will need to keep up technologically as well, which is why it's so important for me that the fighter planes and tanks that are being developed need to be developed with our European partners, particularly with France. We need to build them here in Europe. These projects are now top priority for us.
Bis die neuen Flugzeuge einsatzbereit
Until
sind,
the
werden wir
new
Eurofighter
aircraft get off
gemeinsam
the ground, we will continue to develop the new Eurofighter together. It's also good that the Euro drone contracts were signed this week.
Auch die Anschaffung der bewaffneten
The
Heeresdrohnen
procurement
aus Israel
of
werden
the armed drones from Israel is something we are working on as well.
Und für die nukleare Teilhabe
And
werden
for
wir rechtzeitig
nuclear
einen modernen
participation, we will
Ersatz
need
für die
a
veralteten
modern
Tornado
replacement
schaffen.
for the obsolete Tornado jets. The Eurofighter is going to have electronic warfare capacity, and after that, we will consider
Und
further
schließlich,
options
meine
as
Damen und Herren,
carriers.
werden wir mehr tun,
And we will need to do more in the future in order to ensure a reliable energy supply for our country in the future. One important measure for this is something the German government has already done, and we will have to reposition to get rid of our dependency on individual energy exporters.
Die Ereignisse der letzten Tage und Wochen haben uns doch gezeigt,
The events of recent days and weeks have shown us that a responsible energy policy looking to the future isn't just something that's important for our economy and for our environment, it is also decisive for our security. And this is why the faster we can expand renewable energies, the better it is.
und wir sind auf dem richtigen Weg.
And
Wir wollen
we
als
have set the right course as an
2045
industrial country until 2045. We want to become a zero-carbon industry. And with this aim ahead, there are important decisions that we will have to take. For example, building up a coal and gas reserve. We have decided that the storage long-term options for gas have to be increased to 200 billion cubic meters, and we will have to buy additional natural gas reserves on the market. And we've decided to have 2 LNG reserves and to build them in as soon as we can. The German Economics Minister Habeck, I want to thank very much for all of his efforts. What was necessary in short term can be connected to what we needed long term anyway to achieve a successful transformation. An LNG terminal where natural gas comes to today can take on green hydrogen tomorrow. And naturally, the high energy prices are things we need to look at. Putin's war has hiked up these prices, and that's why this week we've put together a package to ease this burden. We have increased we've got a heating support for low earners and for pensioners, and we will be looking at how to ease this burden on our citizens. Our message is clear. The citizens and the companies in this country will not be left alone in this difficult time. Ladies and gentlemen, the change that Putin has undertaken doesn't just affect our country, it affects Europe as a whole. And this means there are opportunities and challenges. The challenge is to sustainably strengthen the sovereignty of the European Union. The opportunity is that we can join forces in a way that we have shown we are able to do. See, for example, the package of sanctions. For Germany and for all other EU member states, this means not just asking what we can get out of Brussels for our own country, but to ask what is the best decision for the European Union. Europe is our foundation, and only if we understand that will we be able to tackle the challenges facing us. And this brings me to my final point, the fifth one. Putin's war means a break for our foreign policy as well. As much diplomacy as possible without being naive, this aspiration remains. Not being naive, however, also means not speaking just for the sake of doing it. For a true dialogue, there needs to be a willingness on both sides. And there is no willingness on Putin's side. And it's not just been the last few weeks and days that this has been the case. And what does this mean for the future? We will not refuse to speak to Russia, not even in this extreme situation. It remains the job of politicians to keep diplomatic channels open. Anything else would be irresponsible. Ladies and gentlemen, we know what we support based on our own history, what we want. We want peace in Europe. We will never accept violence as a means of policy making. We will always push for a peaceful solution of conflicts, and we will work until there is peace in Europe once again. And we are not alone in this. We are working with our friends and partners in Europe and across the globe. Our greatest strength are our alliances.
verdanken wir das große
We
Glück,
owe it
dass
to
unser
them
Land seit über
that
30
for
Jahren
over 30 years we have been a unified Germany living in prosperity and peace with our neighbors.
wir wollen, dass diese letzten
If
30
we
Jahre
want
keine historische
these
Ausnahme
last 30 years not to be a historic exception, we must do everything we can to work towards cohesion within the EU, the strength of NATO, and closer contacts to those who share our values worldwide. I am optimistic that we will succeed because rarely were we so resolute with our partners as we are today.
Uns eint in diesen Tagen, wir wissen die Stärke
We
freier Demokratie.
know how strong free democracies can be. We know what really can survive in these times. And this is why I want to thank you and all of the parliamentary groups in this parliament who have clearly condemned this Russian attack on Ukraine as what it is, an attack on a country, a war of aggression that is not justified by anything. And I think our motion today makes that very, very clear. And I want to thank all of you who have shown clearly that they are against Putin's war here in Berlin and elsewhere, who have demonstrated against it. And I want to thank everyone who, in these times, support us for a free, open, just, peaceful Europe. We will defend it.
Vielen Dank. Herr Bundeskanzler, Sie müssten Ihre Maske wieder aufsetzen.
Very much, Chancellor. You needed to put on your mask again, please.
Vielen Dank. Ich eröffne die Aussprache.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to open the discussion, and I'd like to give the floor Friedrich Merz from the CDU-CSU group in Parliament.
And so after the special address by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, we're now going to hear from the German opposition leader, CDU party, Friedrich Merz.
Frau Präsidentin,
President of the Parliament,
sehr geehrten Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen,
Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
colleagues,
Dieser 24. September
this
2022
24th of September 2022
allen als ein Tag
is going to be a day which we will remember, and we're going to say about this day in the future that I will remember where I was. When I got the news
und die ersten Bilder
of the war in Ukraine, I know where I were when I saw the pictures of the war in Ukraine, and our first thoughts in this minute
unverändert bis heute dem
went
ganzen Volk.
to the entire people of Ukraine, and this is still the case today.
Wir trauern mit den Familien
We mourn with the families, we mourn the victims.
noch in diesen Stunden und den Minuten in so großer Zahl, auch unter der
We have
Zivilbevölkerung
so many victims amongst the civilian population as well, and we
und den Willen dieses
admire
Volkes
the courage
seine
and the
Freiheit.
determination of these people to fight for their freedom.
Wir sind zugleich,
And at the same time, we feel ashamed
dass wir diesem Land
and depressed
nicht schon haben früher.
that we weren't able to help the Ukrainians earlier.
Unsere größte Bewunderung und unser größter Respekt
Our largest admiration and respect goes to the freely elected President Volodymyr Zelensky.
diesen mutigen Mann, der aus einer
He's a
jüdischen
courageous
Familie
man coming from a Jewish family.
abhängig und als
To
Nazi zu diffamieren.
defame him as a drug addict and Nazi, as the Russian president did in the course of this week, shows a extent of
auf diesem Kontinent nicht erlebt haben.
infamity and disrespect for humans, which we haven't witnessed in this century on the European continent.
Herr Bundeskanzler, Sie haben es so ausgedrückt, mit diesem Krieg geht eine
Chancellor
Zeit
Scholz,
Europa.
you said that with this war, an era is ending in Europe, an era and a time of which we hoped that it would
Freiheit,
bring peace,
Wohlstand,
prosperity,
21. Jahrhundert.
liberty for the 21st century, for the entire 21st century, but we had to learn differently as of a couple of days ago, in a brutal manner, in a
Angriffskrieg mitten in
ruthless manner, an authoritarian regime started a war of aggression in the midst of Europe, because this war is happening, is being waged between the largest territorial countries in Europe. Russia is a European country, as is Ukraine.
Der Krieg findet statt,
And the war
weniger als
takes
2
place
Flugstunden.
less than 2
Aus dem wir uns
flight hours away from where we are convening this Sunday morning. And Chancellor Scholz, on behalf of the CDU and CSU parties, I want to thank you for your policy brief that we have just listened to.
dass wir
You
sehr
know
bemüht sind,
that we make every effort
tragenden Koalitionsfraktionen einen gemeinsamen
to
Weg
find a common path in these times of great challenges. And over the last couple of days,
Antworten,
we fought for common answers with the
gemeinsam mit der
parties of government, and we're reflecting them in a motion for a resolution that we're submitting together with the Greens and the SPD. And this is just the common denominator, the minimum common denominator that we can find today. Today and in the future, we have a very clear position on this war and on the single man who is responsible for this war. And his name is Vladimir Putin.
Aus diesem lupenreinen Demokraten, der nie war, ist nun endgültig
This Democrat, who he never was, turned into a criminal of war, visible and for everybody to see.
aber so ein Krieg
But such a war
befiehlt nicht einer allein.
is not something that only a single person orders. It does not happen without a political environment. The system around him is a web of intelligence officers and masters of the propaganda, like his foreign minister Lavrov. It is a web of ruthless oligarchs around him who took hold of the resources of this country, and it's a web of a repressive apparatus of a state which arbitrarily detains, poisons, puts in camps people, and doesn't shy away from sending hitmen to other cities in Europe to kill opponents of their regime. And at this juncture, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, there should be no misunderstanding. The responsibility lies only with those actors that I mentioned, but part of this web and network are representatives of interests the world over, who present themselves as friends of Russia or those who understand Putin, who don't let anything happen or make everything possible and try to make everything possible to
mit diesem System Geschäfte zu machen,
make
das Ganze
deals
dann
with
auch
the
noch zu
system
versuchen, der
and to try to sell it to the public as being a charity work.
als nützliche Idioten, ganz im Sinne der Leninschen
To name them useful idiots is probably the most friendly description of these activities that we witnessed also here in Germany, ladies and gentlemen.
Die Bedrohung der Ukraine durch einen Angriffskrieg ist aber nicht die einzige
Threatening
Bedrohung, die wir
Ukraine with an aggression
parallel zu den
and
Panzern
with a war of aggression is not the only threat that we are seeing. In parallel to the tanks, we see waves of propaganda rolling through Europe, which in times of digitization and social networks are very efficient and therefore can cause a lot of damage, a damage that also undermines and threatens our social stability from the inside. And part of that propaganda
Dieser Propaganda zählt seit langem die Behauptung,
is the claim that NATO would be the aggressor against the peace-loving Russia.
großartige Land,
This great country
der allmächtige Staatsapparat und sein Präsident gegen eine militärische
now
Bedrohung zur Wehr setzen.
needs to defend themselves against a military threat, according to the state apparatus, but you know it better. You were never threatened by NATO, Mr. Putin, and you know that. You're fully aware of this. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you see who's applauding, who's not applauding, right now, I already know what kind of speeches we will have to wait for in the course of today from the far left and far right sides of this hall. But, ladies and gentlemen, the only threat that there was and is for Putin and his network, and this is something that he justifiably takes very seriously, is the threat to his power by his own people. The threat coming from democracy and freedom in the neighboring countries to Russia. This is what threatens the system. And this is why Putin suppresses and represses any kind of opposition in his own country. And this is why he works along with Alexander Lukashenko, who at this very day, while we're convening today, is holding a referendum in Belarus in order to change the constitution and from tomorrow on so that nuclear weapons can be deployed in Belarus. This is the new reality that we have woken up to in the course of this week. The state community of Western nations, the Europeans, Americans, and many other countries the world over respond to this break of international law and of all treaties that we have signed with Russia. And they respond to this consistently with hard activities. Russia is going to be isolated. The country and its representatives will be isolated. And this includes SWIFT, the international payment system, with which Russia is being excluded now from the international payment system. Chancellor Scholz, thank you very much for having said that in the course of today, that you held intensive negotiations and talks about this topic, including the question how arms shipments from various European countries have to be dealt with from now on. It's very clear and important to get that clear signal. Enough is enough. Game over. But at the same time, I want to be very clear. What we need today is not good speeches. Today, what's needed, and good, yes, good policy briefings of Parliament, yes, that's what we witnessed, but what we also need is consistency and stamina in the days and weeks to come. And this stamina and perseverance is something that will be tested probably in a couple of days' time. And these sanctions are going to unfold its impact not only in Russia but also here in our country. The war in Ukraine is going to have consequences not only when it comes to defense policy but in many other areas of public life too. And therefore, Chancellor, we offer to you and your government comprehensive, concrete support and help If you need support for the sanctions, comprehensive sanctions, you will have our support. And we're not going to criticize minutiae and details. If you want to get an upgrading, and a comprehensive upgrading of our armed forces, which is what we want together with you, we're going to embark upon this path against resistances together with you. If you deem it necessary to change the energy policy of your government, if you, like we, believe that we cannot dispense with any other options of energy generation, you will find our active support for this view. And if you want to achieve what you propose today, then we can talk about this. Special funds of the federal government is not funds in the proper sense of the word, but it's new debt. And how we take up and incur this new debt and how we anchor it in our constitution is something that cannot be done by a policy briefing held on a Sunday morning alone. We need to talk about that calmly and need to cover the necessary details for that. And I want to be very clear. We're going to do that together. Not as a division of labor where we stick out our necks for the unpleasant things and you will then continue distributing all the goodies to the detriment of the younger generation. This is something that we're not going to go along with. But, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, all these are very clear decisions that will have to be taken upon short-term notice, but the real challenge is elsewhere and goes much deeper. At latest with this week, we're seeing the ruins of a German and European foreign and defense policies of the last decades, and some of the certainties, the seeming certainties of the last years have to be relegated to the past, finally. We're not surrounded only by friends. We're also being threatened in our directly neighborhood by an aggressive state. Unilateral reduction of arms doesn't lead to more, but rather to less security and safety. Is there anybody in this parliament who might have forgotten that in 1994, Ukraine ceded all its nuclear weapons, and in consideration to that, they received comprehensive and permanent guarantees for its territorial integrity. Is there anybody who might have forgotten this historic fact? And let me say it in this way: peace prayers, Eastern marches, and candle lines are a nice thing. And we too, earlier this morning, we too, together with a group of members of parliament, prayed for the end of this war and for peace in the world this morning. But with morals alone, the world around us is not going to become peaceful. Not to speak of the better moral that is being purported in Germany time and time again. Good words didn't help Ukraine. Also not a delayed membership in NATO was of no benefit to them. Germany needs to be finally ready to define its interests in this world. Germany needs to be, above all, prepared to assert these interests. This includes not only, but also the capability to defend the own territory and population in an effective manner against any kind of intimidation and violence. And the armed forces, the German armed forces, if we ask them today, They're not able to do that. Well, I'm not going to respond to this corner, but I'm going to respond to that corner. If you want to make that a topic of our party policy discussion, ladies and gentlemen, I've been a member of parliament early on, and in this parliament, we all are responsible for the federal armed forces being in the condition that we find it in today. We made efforts to improve its conditions, and many initiatives fail because of you. And if we are moving forward today, we're going to move forward together, but only if we move forward, and not if you just take a look back and look into history and get entailed in party policy discussions. All these are assumptions and political views that you may or may not share. But the task of leadership, the real task of leadership, will have to be tackled by you, Chancellor Scholz, anyhow. And therefore, let me quote from a major German daily, which describes the situation pretty precisely. At the end of a sobering analysis, the author writes the following: the real bill is going to be footed by Germany. We see a density of crisis which meets an unprepared population, a population which doesn't have the tools at hand to deal with intimidation and military threats that the political system is exposed to. Uncertainty is generated by an aggressor, normally, but it becomes dangerous through weakness. End of quote. The necessary tools, Chancellor, this weakness, to do away with this weakness in our country and to provide the necessary tools, is something that we understand to be the historic task of your chancellorship as of this week. Thank you very much for listening.
And that was Friedrich Merz, opposition leader from the CDU party, speaking there in the German Bundestag following the special address to the Bundestag by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
Nächste Rednerin für die Bundesregierung, die Bundesministerin Annalena Baerbock.
Annalena Baerbock.
That's right. Now we're going to be hearing from Germany's Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock.
President of the Bundestag, colleagues, fellow countrymen and women, the images from Ukraine are unbearable. Thousands fleeing their homes. Nearly everyone in this room has received news from friends, colleagues, people like me last week had lunch with in Kiev who are now saying, please, save us. Parents with small children spending their nights in undergrounds to try and get protection from bombs. That could be us in these underground stations. That could be our children. What's happening in the middle of Europe here was something unimaginable from someone like my generation. It is the moment in which a war of aggression has returned to Europe, our world, after this flagrant breach of international law, a different world after Putin's war. Ambassador Melnik, I welcome you here representing the over 40 million courageous Ukrainians. From the bottom of my heart, let me say that the terrible suffering of the men, women, and children there cuts us to our hearts. We are shocked and horrified at what is being done to the people of Ukraine once again. But we are not powerless. We are not going to leave you alone with this vicious aggression on your country. This war is not a war of the people of Russia. This is Putin's war. This war is an attack on our peace in Europe. This war is an attack on our freedom. This war is an attack on international law. This war is an attack on all values of an international structure of dealing with one another. It is an attack on peaceful coexistence among peoples. It is a war that makes it necessary for us to entirely rethink the foundations of our foreign policy. Just a few weeks ago, regarding weapons exports, I said that our foreign policy about turn, as you like, is something we can change when the moment comes, and alas, the moment has now come. We waited as long as we could for this. We carried out diplomatic efforts as long as we could. The Kremlin lied to us and made ridiculous everything that we have pushed for as Europeans. Putin wanted this war, whatever it takes. Russia attacked Ukraine ruthlessly, and Ukraine, like any country in this world, has a right to defend itself. This is in the Charter of the United Nations. And we, based on the foundation of international law, have a duty to support and defend this Charter of the United Nations together. Perhaps it is the case that Germany has been particularly careful and reticent in the past about international involvement. The rules that we set ourselves as Germany cannot be used to relinquish us from our responsibilities. If we find ourselves in a completely different world, our policy must keep up with this. A country with a parliamentary-approved army and democratic scrutiny can and must allow itself, and we are doing that from today, when it comes to questions of peace and war, to make decisions based on full responsibility. When it comes to weapons, exports, and military operations, we will continue to be reticent and careful. But when Putin attacks Ukraine, we must support Ukraine. Apart from our major economic and humanitarian support for Ukraine, we will now also deliver military material and weapons to Ukraine so it can defend itself. Because we cannot leave Ukraine at the mercy of its aggressor, wreaking havoc and murder on this country. And I want to thank all of you, because that is the strength of our liberal democracy, that we can wage disputes with one another, but when it comes down to defending our basic values, across all parliamentary groups, we join forces. Thank you for that. We are doing that because it's about people's lives, because our international structures, our political structures, are called into question. We're doing it in a calm, reflected manner to defend peace in Europe. And this is also a clear message we are sending to Vladimir Putin. The price of this war waged against innocent people and this flagrant breach of the United Nations will be unbearably high for Putin. We must, and the German Chancellor has emphasized this, do many things at once. We need to ensure that the people in Ukraine are supplied with what they need, with medical aids, with safe places to stay, roofs over their heads. We have contributed to the humanitarian UN emergency fund. We have added 5 million to that. For the international Red Cross community, we have put 10 million euros into that fund. With everything we have, we will work towards ensuring that the people who are forced to flee their homes, that every single one of them get a safe roof over their heads. And we have prepared for that. That is another strength we have, not just within the European Union, but together with our friends in Canada, in the US, and in many other places in the world. We are not going to abandon Ukrainians who have to flee. And yes, we do have to talk about money here, and I would request your support in the draft budget to earmark this money for humanitarian causes so we can support and protect these people. There are 3 further elements that are key. Firstly, sanctions. And the bitter reality is no sanction can stop this insanity right now. If we had a means of sanction that could stop it immediately, we would have put it in place right away. But what our sanctions can do, and this is key, is to show Putin that in the medium and long term, this war will ruin your country. Putin's insidious game must be stopped, and this is why our sanctions must be severe, and that's why we must ensure that we are in it for the long haul, that we don't run out of energy after 3 months. Our sanctions must hit Putin where it hurts. And this is why these things all go hand in hand, economically, financially, and humanitarianly. And this is why, let me say to Putin and to Lavrov, you too are responsible for this war. And this is why there will be further sanctions regarding banks, oligarchs, and family members of those responsible for it. And this is why SWIFT, and I know when I say that word, some people feel nervous, but let me ask for your trust. This is why we have set SWIFT up, so that it will impact on the Putin system and will not boomerang back and affect us. And this is why we are addressing this and taking our international responsibilities seriously. We support our allies, NATO, as the Chancellor has already made clear. NATO is a guarantor of our security and our liberty. That's why it was founded, and nothing has changed in this regard. My last point, yes, we have to show that we are resolute, but we represent international law, and we are committed to international law, which is why dialogue has to be part of it. Not dialogue with the aggressor, but dialogue with the international community. This must be our focus. It's not just about Europe. No country in this world can accept their sovereignty being at the disposal of a stronger neighbor as it suits them. Because if that were the case, Putin would have won. And this is why we need to ensure that all of the member states who support the UN Charter must take a stance against this aggression. So let me appeal to all of our partners worldwide. From this Parliament, next week, take a stance at the UN General Assembly. That is our peace structure. We must defend it together now. And when it comes to the choice between war and peace, the choice between an aggressor and children who have to hide in underground stations, no one can be neutral. Thank you for making that so clear here today.
And that was Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock addressing the Bundestag. For Annalena Baerbock, we heard from the opposition leader Friedrich Merz. And before that, of course, we heard from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, speeches that were really full of emotion. As Annalena Baerbock just said, this is a war that has made it necessary to rethink the foundations of our foreign policy. Here in the studio with us is our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane. Melinda, as I said, some really quite emotional words there from all three. If you can sum it up for us, what were the most important messages, starting with the speech that Chancellor Olaf Scholz made?
We really heard all three speakers recognizing that this is a wrenching moment for the German people, that people are sitting at their tables saying, what's going on? How can there be war once again in Europe? And so what we're seeing here from all of them is an attempt to really put this in context, as both the Chancellor said and the opposition leader in different words. The world today is different from the world before the 24th of February. And in some ways, what we're looking at is, for Germans, the end of the thinking that has been a continual theme throughout the post-war era. Germany, having learned that lesson from World War II, never again war, that meant to many Germans that Germany, in a way, was renouncing military action. Of course, it's part of NATO. Of course, it does have a military, and it does commit some spending to military hardware and software. But nonetheless, there was a sense that military tools, as Clausewitz said, military measures as a continuation of policy and diplomacy were off limits for Germans, and that diplomacy is everything. And that's a lesson that reflected not only World War II, but also the Cold War, when Germany became famous for Ostpolitik, Willy Brandt's attempt to reach out across the Iron Curtain to the countries of Eastern Europe through cultural exchange, through diplomacy, and thereby take them along in a process of change. And for many Germans, especially on the left side of the political spectrum, that's what brought the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain down, not necessarily deterrence, although in fact the Social Democratic Party here in the Cold War also practiced deterrence by stationing Pershing weapons that definitely helped to bring the Soviet Union to its knees. At any rate, what we're now hearing from all three is we're in a different world, and to the German people, we now must stand up and defend our values and defend our democracy, because this war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It is about all of Europe. It is about the security order of Europe. As the Chancellor said, it's about whether we go back to a 19th century realpolitik where might makes right and the strongest determine the shape of Europe. And I think a very clear recognition that this is going to mean changes, as you said, not only in foreign policy, but in energy policy, in defense policy, in relations with allies, and, of course, in relations with Russia. And we also heard a very strong message from all three saying, we actually can't do business with Putin anymore as we thought we could. And Chancellor Scholz quoted himself once again saying as much diplomacy as possible without naivete, and then said, but we have learned, essentially, we cannot now conduct dialogue with Putin. It's not working.
It was interesting because actually the last thing that Scholz was talking about was that we want peace in Europe and we will always push for peaceful solutions. However, the world is now different. And I mean, we were hearing things that we would never, ever have expected just months ago, you know, talking about this important investment in the military to great applause, I might add.
100 billion in this year alone now being earmarked for upgrading the military, and boy, does it need upgrading. As we know, many capabilities of the German military looking very, very rusty in recent years. And then he said very clearly, in black and white, we will be committing more than 2% of our GDP to military spending. NATO allies have been pushing for that for years and years, one U.S. president after another. I think many of us remember even the pressure that was put on by Barack Obama on this. Well, apparently, it is finally going to come to pass. That is a very, very big step for a social democratic chancellor to take.
Absolutely. It's extraordinary times. Chief Political Correspondent Melinda Crane, thank you for your analysis. All right, and we're going to be crossing now to our Chief Political Editor, Michaela Küffner, who was there listening to those speeches. Michaela, give us a sense of what's just been said, the enormity of what's just been said there.
Look, I'm still rubbing my ears and eyes, frankly. It is safe to say that over the past 24 hours, with the turnaround on German policy to now deliver weapons to Ukraine after all, slapping all of a sudden more than twice the current defense budget on top of the Bundeswehr budget, which still has to be decided in the Bundestag, now calling Vladimir Putin out as an aggressor who clearly nobody here in Germany believes they can still do business with, wanting to strengthen NATO, and the Green Party and the Social Democrats, who are traditionally leaning towards pacifism, now saying, yes, this is what is required right now. It is actually safe to say that over the past 24 hours, we have seen a paradigm shift in German security, defense, and foreign policy, as we have not seen over the past 24 years in total. That is the magnitude of what has happened here today in the German Bundestag. And this is also why we saw very emotional scenes with the Ukrainian ambassador being in the room here today, with parliamentarians standing ovations for him, resounding support of Ukraine, and a unity between the opposition and the governing Social Democrat coalition, which I have not seen before. And this is all less than 100 days into Olaf Scholz being Chancellor here in Germany.
Now, this brings me on to my next question. We also heard from Friedrich Merz, the opposition leader. We heard the fact that he was talking about a common path, parties united, we're offering support. So this really can be seen at the moment as unity to an extent amongst Germany's political parties, main political parties.
Absolutely. Resounding unity, that firm action, unity is needed, that defense spending has to skyrocket. It's nothing below that. That now NATO needs to be united, that unity, Olaf Scholz said, is the strength of the West, that this is a historic moment. We live in a new era, he said, that requires that unity also to be carried forward. And Friedrich Merz, who is Angela Merkel's successor as party leader, who lost in the past elections, did not become Chancellor, he actually said we all here share the responsibility for the underfunding of the German armed forces. They need to be able to defend themselves. They were at pains actually to determine what they could actually deliver to Ukraine in support because there's such an overstretching of resources in the German armed forces. So it truly is a new era also in terms of how Germany is thinking about its own security and assisting partners. But there's one caveat, of course, I have to say, because opposition is opposition. Friedrich Merz said, well, those 100 billion euros, we still need to talk about this because that would mean taking on new debt, something they are fundamentally opposed. But at this crucial moment in time, the broadest possible imaginable unity with even those voices in the Greens who have an audience that is against any form of bolstering defense whatsoever, now being on board to take this very unusual step here by Olaf Scholz.
DW's chief political editor, Michaela Küffner, thank you very much. OK, returning to the latest events on the ground in the Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russian forces of targeting civilian infrastructure after a fourth night of attacks across Ukraine. Overnight, Moscow hit airfields and fuel facilities, including a civilian oil depot 30 kilometers south of Kyiv. Its forces also blew up a pipeline near Kharkiv in the east. Authorities say the blast could cause an environmental catastrophe that Ukraine's pipeline operator says it hasn't yet affected supply. This comes as some Russian forces were seen entering the city after meeting stiff resistance. They've ordered to advance in Ukraine from all directions. And we can cross straight to DW correspondent Fanny Fachar, who's in Khmelnytsky in western Ukraine. Good morning, Fanny. Tell us about the night and how things are looking where you are this morning.
Relatively calm where I am right now, but people are always preparing. Where is the next shelter? Where can they go to if again they hear there's an alarm? You have to go. There are military there's a military airbase nearby, military warehouse about 30 to 50 kilometers from here that have been attacked during the previous days. Not last night, however, but there was a critical infrastructure attacked near Kyiv, as we have just heard, an oil terminal, and also there was a lot of fighting in the northeastern part of Kyiv. Apparently saboteurs dressing as Ukrainian soldiers and apparently also taking a tank, most likely from a military airbase near Kyiv that's been heavily fought between Ukrainian and Russian forces. There is conflicting information whether that military airbase Hostomel is now in Russian or in Ukrainian hands. But as we have just heard President Zelensky pointing out, there were really a lot of attacks, missiles that were raining basically over various Ukrainian cities, also attacking civilian infrastructure. And he also said that the Russian forces don't even take care to at least try to prevent, to attack ambulances or anything that's somehow connected to civilian infrastructure. So very difficult night in various parts once again in Ukraine.